So my name is Eva. I'm just going to give you an example today of some research that I did with Temple Street and UCD and GMI. And it isn't an example of research in autism, I suppose, but it's an example of genomics research and how it can really help patients and in particular children, I suppose. This is a research project that's ongoing with GMI and Temple Street and a number of other hospitals around the country as well. But this specific project that I was involved in, we had a cohort of children who had movement disorders. So movement disorders are any disorders, it's in the name really, where there's a problem with movement. So that can range from somebody who has difficulty walking to people who are completely wheelchair bound by their movement disorder, by their disability. And often we'll know what the cause for the movement disorder is. For example, cerebral palsy in a child who might have had an injury around the time of birth. But oftentimes there is no obvious cause for the movement disorder, and we don't know why it happened in a particular child. So these children end up going through a lot of investigations to try and find a cause for their movement disorder, and that ranges from blood tests to maybe imaging, MRIs, scans, lumbar punctures, often things that are quite painful and difficult to go through for a child. So what we did was we took a group of children with movement disorders that had been through that kind of process and still had no diagnosis. So a lot of them are extremely disabled, and it's very difficult for them and for their parents to not understand why this happened to the child. So we recruited them to this project with GMI, where we did whole genome sequencing on them and their parents to try and see if we could find in those 3 billion base pairs, if we could find even just one that was what we call a spelling mistake in the child that could be the cause for their problem. So I'll introduce you to this patient. Her name is Marianne, and this is the first time we met her. She's 4 years old in this video, and you can see already looking that she's having difficulty walking. So she's 4 years old, so she would be, say, in junior infants in school. And if you look closely as well, you can see in the way she's moving her hands, she kind of has an awkward way of holding the pieces. And even if you look at her hand that isn't doing the pieces, it's being held in a kind of awkward position. And she's obviously struggling a little bit to get the pieces into the where they're supposed to go. Even though you can see she knows where the pieces are supposed to go and she knows what she's supposed to be doing, but it's her physical disability that's holding her back from doing that. I'll just show you a little bit more of her walking as well. She spent a long time on the jigsaw. So she was falling a lot at this stage. She was 4 years old, as I said, but a very determined girl. Every time she would fall down, she would get herself back up. So that's when we first met her, and I suppose her story was that she was the third child of her parents. The other children were well. The pregnancy and birth, everything was fine. Her early milestones were all normal. She seemed to be developing normally. She walked at 16 months. Her first words were before the age of a year, and everything was fine, really, until the age of 1, when her left foot started to turn in. And then over time that progressed. So it started in her left foot, then went into her right foot, then went into her left arm and into her right arm and into her neck and up into her jaw and her mouth. And her speech had been normal until the age of 3, but then she began to regress in her speech between the ages of 3 and 4, but really more because of physical difficulty with actually moving her mouth to speak. So she was seen in the UK. She lived in the UK, but the family were Irish originally, so she was referred to Dublin to see Professor King, who I worked for at the time, for a second opinion, because they didn't really understand what was going on with her. And I suppose when we saw her was that first video, and she was diagnosed at that stage with having a generalized dystonia. So dystonia was just the name of the type of movement disorder that she had, these kind of twisting movements, difficulty walking, difficulty moving her whole body. Unfortunately, things got worse for her. So this was her at the age of 6, 2 years later. You can see she can't move at all. She's completely physically disabled. She's got a feeding tube in because she can no longer feed. She can no longer speak. But you can see, I don't know if it comes across in the video, but she's still of completely normal intelligence. So she's knows exactly everything that's going on, but she's unable to communicate. You can see at the very end here, she still has her smile, which she kept the whole time. So I suppose, yeah, so sorry, this is where we are now. She can't walk. As you can see, she could sit if you really helped her and roll on the floor, but had this dystonia in all 4 limbs, which you could see between the ages of 4 and 6 really got a whole lot worse. Her comprehension and her ability to understand speech was perfect, but couldn't feed or speak anymore. And this is just kind of a snapshot of the investigations that she had. So she had lots of blood tests, which were repeated over and over again. Lots of genetics already sent on her, urine tests, CSF, which is when we take a sample of the spinal fluid from the back, imaging, MRI scans, which required a general anaesthetic for her, so it's not undertaken lightly. And I suppose all because, if you can imagine, this family, we had absolutely no idea why this was happening to their child and had no answers for them and no hope for any real treatment. We had tried her on a couple of different medications, but there was no benefit at all from any of them. So we enrolled her in our study because she kind of fit the exact description of what we were looking for, a child with an undiagnosed movement disorder who'd been extensively worked up. And with GMI, we found a variant in this gene, KMT2B. And I suppose, to put it in context, when I worked with GMI, we'd get the results back and, they'd be filtered down. And if you were the person analysing the data, you'd get maybe 6,000 to 10,000 variants on each person to go through. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack, trying to find what's significant, because, as we've heard already, everybody has variants in their genome and it just makes us all different. But the question for us is always, well, could this be the cause of the disease? And that's a really hard question to answer sometimes, because first of all, you have to know something about the gene. You have to know, has this exact variant been described before? What does this variant what impact is it likely to have on the protein, etc. So anyway, we found this de novo, meaning it was just in Marianne, it wasn't in her parents, it was something that had happened just in her, which did make us obviously a bit more suspicious because her parents weren't affected. But this gene was one that we'd only just become aware of recently. So just the year, actually really just a couple of months before we found this variant in Marianne, this group in the UK had described 27 individuals with a progressive childhood onset dystonia that started in the feet, started in one foot, moved to the other, moved to the arms, moved up into the jaw and into the mouth. So we, initially we were very excited by this because that sounded exactly like what had been wrong with Marianne. And I suppose the big thing that came out of this paper was that they found that a lot of the patients who had variants in this gene responded very well to deep brain stimulation. Deep brain stimulation is where there's an implant is placed into the brain. It's a surgical procedure. You might have seen it for things like Parkinson's disease before. And it's not something that we do in children really at all in this country, but very often at all, because it's obviously a big procedure and often doesn't work in children. But the big thing that came from this was people who had variants in this gene as a cause of their dystonia did respond to deep brain stimulation. So we were hopeful, and then another paper came out with 30 other patients with almost the exact same story as what we'd seen in Marianne, with the generalised dystonia starting in the feet and moving up. And again, they found a clinical benefit from deep brain stimulation as well. So we phoned the UK, where she was living, and at that time she was actually in intensive care in status dystonicus, which is a condition where the dystonia becomes overwhelming and the muscles are in spasm and start to break down. So she was on a ventilator on life support in intensive care in the UK, and I suppose they were at a stage where they were saying, we don't know what's wrong with this child, she's critically unwell, where are we going? You know, how are we going to ever make her better to get her out of ICU? And, you know, the futility, I suppose, of continuing her care. But we said to them, well, look, we found this variant, you know, you should put in a deep brain stimulator in her. It's the one thing that's been shown to help, and it might be a bit of a long shot, but it's worth it. So she got rushed straight to London to have a deep brain stimulator put in, and this is her a week after that was put in. So, you know, a week before this, she was on a life support machine, not able to breathe for herself. So this was her 1 week after the deep brain stimulator was put in. So you can see even from the last video, which was even a year before, she's moving a lot more. She's much more comfortable. She's able to sit in a wheelchair, which she hadn't been able to do before, and still smiling, obviously. And that was about a year ago now. So I suppose this is a photo of her a couple of weeks after her deep brain stimulator was put in. So now she's at home, she's walking, and she's talking, and she's able to feed again, and she's going back to school this year. So I suppose, although it's not a story of autism and genomics, it's a story of how genomics can help where there was no hope for her before. It's really changed her life. So yeah, that's the story of Miriam.